en los webinars pasados sobre el enfoque jurisdiccional y cómo el mercado red en Colombia se está desarrollando. Digamos, hay cierta percepción de riesgo sobre la gestión que pueda estar o no estar haciendo el gobierno y sobre lo fácil que pueda ser el mercado de red plus en Colombia. Ustedes saben que la resolución 1447 permite a los proyectos excluirse de la jurisdicción. O sea que, pero eso, digamos, o sea, pueden hacerse proyectos red igual en el mercado voluntario. Eso es un tema muy importante. También saben, y algo de eso, pues hemos medio tocado en los webinars pasados, que lo que controla por ahora el gobierno es la actividad de forestación, no ha metido las otras actividades, digamos, en, 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 en estas potenciales jurisdicciones de que se están hablando, programas que puedan llegar a establecerse por parte del gobierno. Y también hay unos pools de carbono que han quedado por fuera, o sea que hay, digamos, bastantes opciones de mercado en Colombia para Red Plus, pero sobre todo quisiéramos ver entonces qué pasa afuera, porque pues lo que quisiéramos todos los desarrolladores es poder tener claras las opciones de comercialización y financiación de nuestros proyectos o programas red eh, en el mercado internacional. Por eso es tan importante la presentación de hoy. Tenemos dos presentadores importantes para iniciar este tema. En primer lugar, Estefano de Clara, director de Política Internacional de la Asociación Internacional de Comercio de Emisiones, IETA, que es como lo conocemos todos, y Simon Henry, que es el director para el desarrollo de mercados de carbono también de IETA. Ellos harán la primera presentación y van pues, a hacer una presentación general sobre los mercados de carbono, van a tocar sobre el artículo 6 y por supuesto las opciones para Red Plus. Después seguirá Michael Radomir, que ya conocemos todos en Azocarbono, director ejecutivo de Code Red. También va a hacer una presentación sobre los mercados ya desde el punto de vista de una institución que está permanentemente buscando mercados para los proyectos Red Plus. Entonces, va a ser un poco seguramente más detallada que la primera presentación. En todo caso, estas primeras presentaciones, como les dije anterior, son más de corte general para seguramente ir profundizando en los diferentes temas en las siguientes sesiones. Entonces, con esta introducción voy a dejar a Estefano de Clara y a Simon Henry a que hagan su presentación. Stefano, you're there, right?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Thanks, and thank you for the invite to be here and present today. Can you actually see the slides, or should I pull them up?
Yeah, you should pull them and just share the screen with us, please.
Okay, just a second. And then, so I'll start the presentation. I'll give you some context on the global landscape for international credits and on the Paris Agreement, and then I'll give the floor to my colleague Simon for a bit more of a deep dive into NCS and Red Plus. So let me see if I can share the screen. I need to give it permission. Just one second. Okay. Can you see anything?
Not yet.
Not sure what's happening because I'm hitting on share And it seems to go okay, but then again, it doesn't share it. Simon, can you maybe pull up the presentation? Or Juan Andreas?
Let me see. Yeah, I have. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna try to share it myself then.
Thanks.
Just let me know when
about that. I'm not sure
Okay.
why. Maybe I need to be a presenter to do that.
Okay. Can you all see the presentation now?
Yeah. If you can
Okay,
just
great.
put it full screen. Great, perfect. Thank you. So if you go on the next slide, and I think you're fairly familiar with AITA already, given that we collaborate quite closely with Astro Carbono. But again, just to make sure we're on the same page. So AITA is a global cross-sector business association that brings together businesses from a broad range of different sectors in support for emission trading and carbon markets, as a way to put a price on CO2 emissions and as a way to reduce CO2 emissions. So again, on the next slide, you can see who our members are, and we have around 140 members from a wide range of different sectors. Our members are companies that both have a compliance obligation in one of the existing markets, meaning that they have emissions that have to reduce and they have to comply with emission trading systems around the world. But we also represent companies that don't have a compliance obligation and participate to carbon markets because they see a business opportunity in it. And this is, again, just to say that we do represent a broad range of different stakeholders and different perspectives in the carbon markets. If we go on the next slide, please. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I just wanted to give some context on what is the global landscape when we talk about carbon markets and when we talk about international credits. So we are on the edge of the transition between the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, which are the two main agreements that have regulated, in the case of the Kyoto Protocol, climate action for the last couple of decades, or that will regulate, in the case of the Paris Agreement, international climate action for the foreseeable future. And these two international agreements are very different in nature and will have profound impacts for how the landscape of international credits will work. So under the Kyoto Protocol, you had 37 countries that had targets and emission reduction commitments.
Stefano? Sorry, I lost Stefano. Can you? Hello? Yeah, can you hear Stefano? Stefano?
Hello, can you hear me?
Now yes. Let me put it back. Okay, yeah.
Sorry, I'm not sure what happened there. So, and this is just to say that we are moving from a binary world, such as the one of the Kyoto Protocol, where you had countries with commitments and countries without commitments, and most of the international credits under the Kyoto Protocol were originated in countries without an emission reduction commitment, to a situation such as the one that you can see in the next slide under the Paris Agreement, where everyone will have a commitment. Of course, commitments will be different and will be determined at the national level by the governments. but all the credits and all the international trade in carbon will happen between countries and between jurisdictions that have commitments and that will have to account for those commitments. So the way that things will work is different in a way. If we move on to the next slide, we obviously have market provisions under the Paris Agreement that can be found in Article 6. And Article 6 will provide the framework for all international carbon markets under the Paris Agreement. And this is important because when we talk about, as we will do in a second, about REDD+ and about NCS, it's important to keep in mind that this will all happen under the framework of the Paris Agreement, and Article 6 of the Paris Agreement can accommodate different kinds of REDD+ transactions and different kinds of REDD+ approaches. And of course, as we all know, the Article 6 rules are still being drafted and will be hopefully adopted at COP26, which will take place next year in Glasgow. If we move on to the next slide. I just wanted to provide a quick glimpse on what nature-based solutions and REDD+ might have to contribute under the Paris Agreement and under Article 6. If we go on to the next slide again. This is just a quick takeaway from a modeling project that we did to understand the economic and environmental potential of Article 6. And we modeled how much Article 6 could contribute to the to saving costs and to abate emissions under the Paris Agreement and under the nationally determined contribution commitments that all parties have. And we found that Article 6 overall has a really big potential to reduce cost and also to deliver additional mitigation under the Paris Agreement. And a good share of that potential, especially when it gets to increased ambition, roughly 50% of that comes from what we called nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions. So from the forestry sector and from the land use sector. And again, this indicates that these sectors and these kind of approaches have a huge potential under the Paris Agreement. If we go on to the next slide. Without getting into the details of this slide, this is also just to show that including and developing land use change and forestry into Article 6 approaches and having framework for to do that, such as REDD+ or other NCS methodologies, can also radically change the way that countries can benefit from Article 6 and from international markets, and can also have an impact on the way that a country approaches the international market. So this provides the overall division between sellers and buyers in a potential international market. And this division changes, as you can see in the two graphs on the right and in the center, depending on whether you include or not land use change and forestry in Article 6, or if you exclude them. And that tells you, other than giving a clear indication of what the potential is, it also indicates the importance of developing frameworks for REDD+ and for NCS approaches under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. If we go on to the next slide, and again, this is just to give you an idea that even though we are still waiting for rules on Article 6 to emerge from the UNFCCC negotiations, there are already several initiatives that are moving ahead and are trying to find ways to pilot and to implement Article 6 approaches, and to understand how they might work, and how they can scale up and move forward. As you can see from the map, there are different Article 6 pilots and studies on how to implement cooperative approaches under Article 6 across almost all continents. And one thing that it's worth highlighting here is that even though there are already some Article 6 pilots out there at the moment, there is still little capacity or little experience on piloting Article 6 approaches in the context of NCS more broadly, or REDD+ more specifically. And that is definitely a space to explore, keeping in mind the huge potential that we just saw from the modeling study that AITA and the University of Maryland worked on, and that also tells you that is a space to watch and to approach as we go forward, if we want to understand how to make use of the potential of REDD+ and NCS under Article 6. Again, I don't want to take too much time with this introduction, so I'll hand the floor over to my colleague Simon to take you into some more REDD+ and NCS focused considerations in the next few slides. Simon, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Stefano, and good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the current demand, or the current markets for REDD+, and I'll move on to the potential markets that may come online in the future. Before I get into the detail of REDD+ in particular, I'll start with just a couple of high-level slides, and these come from the latest version of the World Bank's State and Trends report that they produce every year. And this graph shows the total credit issuances by volume and by sector. So these are the total carbon credits that have been issued to date. And so on the left-hand side, we see the standards, or the registries, as they call them. And on the right-hand side, we see where those credits have come from. And that bar in the middle is the type of credits. So we can see that historically, the CDM has been by some distance the largest provider, creator of carbon credits to date. The JI, its sister mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol, just below that, and then the first sort of independent standard in that list is the VCS, and you can see there that a lot of the VCS volume to date has gone into forestry. A lot of that coming from North America, but also other parts of the world. So forestry in this broad list of credit issuances has been a very significant contributor, but still some way behind those other categories of renewable energy, industrial gases, and fugitive emissions. But it's worth adding that those categories of carbon credit types will either disappear or will no longer be eligible in the future. So Verra, for instance, is already scaling down and not allowing carbon crediting from renewable energy. So the big growth area going forward will likely be in forestry. And we can see some of that development in the next slide, if we can go on. So this graph shows credit issuances over just the last couple of years, so 2015 to 2019. And as you can see there, forestry has now become the biggest source of carbon credits globally. The graph also breaks down those bars into different sort of program types. So the orange is independent, so standards like Verra again, or American Carbon Registry. And then the blue is the regional or national standards. So as we can see, there's a fairly even split there on the forestry bar between independent standards and regional national standards. And I don't have the exact breakdown of that bar, but my guess is that, yeah, it's probably ACR and Verra in particular, and Climate Action Reserve in the US that have contributed a lot of that orange bar to forestry. And then the blue is probably California, where again, we see a lot of forestry in the California cap and trade. And then, you know, I think that's an important message there is just the growth of forestry in particular in the last few years. So it really has overtaken renewable energy, and you know, it has definitely established itself as the biggest category or the biggest technology type in the global market for carbon credits. So my next few slides, I'll look at where some of this demand is going, and I'm going to start with the voluntary market. And this is the latest graph from Ecosystem Marketplace. I realized that I didn't add the reference to this slide, but this graph comes from the latest report published by Ecosystem Marketplace, who gather a lot of the data in the voluntary carbon market. And I think there's a few interesting messages from this this graph. So the dark blue color shows the issuances of carbon credits over the last few years, and the lighter blue is retirements. So the graph really shows supply of credits and demand for credits. And we can see that in 2019, retirements were just under 70 million credits. And you know, if you roll back just to 2016, we were only at around 33 million tons. So just in the last 3 or 4 years, the market has doubled in terms of demand for credits. When you look at supply, the market has more than doubled. You know, it's gone from 36 million up to 142 million. So we've seen a massive increase in issuance of credits, which on the one hand is encouraging. It shows that there is lots of development going on out there. There's lots of activity and lots of projects that are issuing credits. But the graph also shows that there is now quite a big gap between supply and demand. And that obviously translates through into credit price. So although we've seen lots of interest and lots of activity in the voluntary market, that gap between supply and demand means that the market is very well supplied relative to demand, and that means that prices are pretty low, and it's very much a buyer's market. And you can see some of that in the next slide, if we can go on to that. So this table breaks down some of that data from the previous slide into a lot more detail. So it shows the categories of carbon credits in the voluntary market, where they're coming from. So which sectors: forestry and land use, renewable energy, waste disposal, etc. And then it shows the volume and the price for each of those sectors. So I've highlighted in green the forestry and land use sector, and I've just sort of highlighted, picked out in the red circles a few of the interesting bits of this data, I think. So if we go back to 2017, you can see that the volume of credits issued from forestry and land use was very low. Well, in the context of the voluntary market, it was quite high. It was one of the biggest sources, but actually in terms of absolute volume, 16.6 million tons is not very big. And then we saw a massive increase in volume between 2017 and 2018. So we went from 16.6 million tons up to 50 million tons in 2018. So, you know, doubling, tripling in terms of volume in just 1 year. So it was a very big increase. 2019, we actually saw quite a big decrease again in volumes, and we saw a corresponding increase from renewable energy. So I've highlighted in 2019 the renewable energy figure of 42.4 million tons. So that was actually the biggest source of credits in 2019. And that, I think, comes about because standards like Verra are putting in place restrictions on crediting from renewables, because renewables have now become very cheap around the world. They no longer satisfy the additionality criteria. So I think we've seen a rush of development in renewables to get those last projects over the line. So perhaps there's been less of a focus in the land use sector. But what's interesting, I think, about 2019's data for forestry and land use is the price that we're seeing for credits. So although the volume has come down, the average price per credit has gone up. So it's gone up from $3.2 per ton in 2018 to 4.3. So it's gained over $1 on average between 2018 and 2019. And then that makes the value of the forestry and land use sector in the voluntary market in 2019 by far the biggest. Nearly $160 million of value in the voluntary market last year, compared to 60 million from renewable energy, the next sector down. So again, if you look at the value of the voluntary market, a huge amount of the total value is in the forestry and land use sector. And going forward, as I mentioned, renewable energy will disappear or will decrease from these numbers. So I suspect we will see the forestry and land use sector once again become the largest source of supply and definitely the largest source of value. And if we look at just some of the bigger voluntary commitments that we've seen in the last few months over the course of 2020, even in the last few days during Climate Week, we continue to see big companies, big emitters coming forward with very ambitious targets to go net zero, to go carbon neutral. I'm thinking of announcements like the One World Alliance announcement 2 weeks ago, 13 airlines committing to go carbon neutral by 2019. And a lot of the carbon credit purchasing from those big emitters is likely to be in the forestry and land use sector. So I think going forward, both supply and demand in the voluntary market from forestry and land use will continue to grow and will continue to be very large. So if we can move on to the next slide. The other aspect I wanted to highlight around REDD+ is climate finance. And when I say climate finance, this is a bit different to carbon markets. These are either multilateral funds or individual countries paying for emissions reductions. So they are paying for results. They're not buying carbon credits that are tradable, that can be used for offsetting claims. These are essentially governments paying for forestry protection in various parts of the world to deliver emissions reductions. And there's a number of initiatives and schemes out there. I've highlighted just a few on this map. So, and there's two multilateral funds in particular that I've highlighted. The FCPF, which is run by the World Bank, so that is the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, and the GCF, the Green Climate Fund. And both of those are donor funds. So in the FCPF, we have about 14 countries who have donated money into that fund. The World Bank manages the fund, and then money is distributed to forest nations for national REDD+ programs. And there's about 40 countries, 40 forest nations in that fund, though to date only 4 contracts have been signed with forest nations. So 3 of them are in Africa: Ghana, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Mozambique. And then also Chile was the last country to sign a contract, sign an agreement with the FCPF. And these are quite big agreements, quite big deals. The FCPF ones are generally around $50 million for around 10 million tons of emissions reductions. So the FCPF uses a benchmark price for those emissions reductions of about $5 a ton. But it's worth stressing there as well, that is $5 for emissions reductions. It's not $5 for a carbon credit that can be traded, that can be used for other purposes like CORSIA. It's really $5 to buy results. The other big fund is the GCF, and they've signed more agreements than the FCPF. So in Latin America, they've signed agreements with Brazil, Paraguay, Colombia, Chile, and Ecuador. Colombia was the last agreement to be signed at the GCF's meeting back in August, just last month. And that was an agreement for $7 million for 28 million tons of emissions reduction. So that when you look on a ton basis, they're paying less than the FCPF. Though the GCF has also signed other agreements with other countries where they've paid higher amounts for the emissions reductions. Another big player in this climate finance space is Norway. So Norway has an agreement with Indonesia to, again, buy or pay for emissions reductions from forestry. So they've made payments to Indonesia and Brazil in the past. And then the last one I've put on this slide is CAFI, the Central Africa Forest Initiative, which again I think has Norwegian money involved, and they have an agreement in Gabon as well. So in terms of absolute money being spent, absolute sort of capital going to REDD+, these donor funds and these initiatives are very big sources of finance to REDD+. Especially in tropical parts of the world, Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. And then if we can move on to my final slide. And then in this last slide, I've just added a few comments of where we may see new markets emerging where REDD+ has a role. So Colombia is the first one on the list. We're hoping that the Colombian ETS, the rulebook for that, will be published quite soon. And I suspect everyone on the call is very knowledgeable about the program in Colombia and what may happen. But certainly within IETA, we've been following developments. We're very keen to see the emissions trading system emerge. And REDD+ is likely to have a role in that new market. But at this stage, without the rules, we don't know what the details of that will be. But we're hopeful that REDD+ will play a role in the new emissions trading system. The second market on that list is CORSIA, so the aviation market. And at the moment, REDD+ has been excluded from CORSIA. So there were 6 offset programs applied in the first round to CORSIA to be recognized to sell credits into the CORSIA market. Verra was one of them. The rules around what happened with Verra are quite complicated, but essentially they applied a number of restrictions on Verra and the types of credits from Verra that could be accepted into CORSIA. Verra then have resubmitted their application, partly because of the exceptions that were made to them. So I think Verra are expecting results, or they're expecting decisions to be taken on their resubmitted application in December, so fairly soon. So it could be that we see some REDD+ from Verra being accepted into CORSIA. And then CORSIA has also had a second round of applications from offset programs. So we saw applications from Art Trees. This is the new REDD+ standard managed by Winrock. Se Carbono was another one. And then I should also add that the FCPF, the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, they have a standard, their methodological framework, as they call it, that also applied to be accepted into CORSIA, and they received conditional approval. So they haven't got final approval, but it's possible that they will get that final approval again in December this year. So I think by the end of this year, we will see REDD+ being on the list of acceptable credits into CORSIA. So that will create a market demand for REDD+ credits. The challenge, though, that comes with CORSIA is around the demand. As we know, the volume and the number of flights being taken globally has massively decreased because of the pandemic. So that has reduced demand that will come in CORSIA. And we've also seen a change to the baseline. So the baseline for CORSIA that determines the demand levels has been shifted to 2019. So again, it could be that we see very low levels of demand in CORSIA for a number of years going forward, even though REDD+ may be an acceptable unit. It could be that there's just not much demand for any units under CORSIA for a number of years. The third market on that list is Mexico. Mexico started their pilot ETS in January actually in January this year. It says January 2021 on the slide, but it should say January 2020. And at this stage, it's not it's more of a simulation than a proper traded market with financial obligations. But we are expecting some details on the types of offsets eligible into the Mexican market, potentially by the end of this year, though it may be delayed. And again, the role of forestry in the Mexican market, well, it's yet to be determined, but we're hopeful that forestry will play, a significant role within the Mexican ETS. And then the last slide on there is California. So the topic of REDD+ and being accepted into the California cap and trade has been discussed for a number of years. And last year they did endorse the tropical forest standard. So this is the standard they have developed, which could allow for REDD+ being accepted into the market. I should add that there's a difference between endorsing the standard and then accepting REDD+ units. So endorsing the standard is just the first step, and there's a number of other steps that would need to be taken before REDD+ could be accepted into the California market, but it is the first step. So it's possible in a number of years' time that we could see REDD+, jurisdictional REDD+, international REDD+, especially from countries like Brazil, where they've had the most discussions. It's possible that we could see that type of credit being accepted into the California cap and trade. And that concludes my presentation. So thank you very much, everyone, and look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon and Stefano. The format for these webinars is that we take questions after the second presentation. So we take questions on both presenters, on both presentations at the end. So I'll give the floor to Mr. Michael Radomir. Michael, let me just take down this sharing. Where is this? Okay, so you can now put your presentation, Michael. Mientras que Michael pone la presentación, para acordarle a todo el mundo que las preguntas se pueden ir haciendo en el chat, ¿no? Aquí estamos tomando nota para hacerlas en el orden que van llegando. Gracias.
Hi, Juan. Okay, thank you. So, share content. Does that work for everybody? The right profile on the screen. Please give me just 1 second. Okay. Right. Well, you should be seeing my screen now. So it's not in a perfect PowerPoint format. It's actually in a PDF, which is not quite going full screen, but should be okay. So thank you very much, Juan Andres and Stefano and Simon. Can I see the presentation? Okay. Juan, are you there?
Yes, I cannot see the presentation yet.
You cannot see it yet. Okay, I've pressed share. Let me try some.
Is next to the microphone, next to the microphone icon?
Yeah.
Should be that one.
Now is it showing?
Juan, igual debes, entiendo que dejar de compartir primero para que Michael pueda compartir.
Yo ya dejé compartir, ¿no? O sea,
is it showing?
No, he's not.
It might be the same problem I had.
Juan Andres, do you want to put? Can you do it from your side?
Yeah, let me get to it. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
See where it is. Here is your presentation. Yes, just loading. Let me see if I can. I'll try to make it wider.
I couldn't get it quite to format full screen, unfortunately, but it doesn't matter.
Okay, but is this a good size? I guess. Yeah. Well, let's do it like from here. Okay.
No, it needs to be slightly bigger, just slightly. Can you get rid of that left blue column? Don't worry if not.
No.
Okay.
But I can do it. Yeah. Okay. There we go.
So I just want to start by reviewing the types of REDD+ markets and looking at sort of some of the key classifications. I think it's quite basic. It's been touched on before previous presentations, but you know, the key thing when we talk about REDD+ markets is to understand, especially now, that the governments are really the key stakeholder, right? As we move, we're now in 2020 and we start the national level reporting. You know, governments really have to have the final say on what type of REDD+ markets they allow. And, you know, in Colombia, where we're focused on for this discussion, there has been an indication that the government clearly wants to support private sector involvement, wants to enable exports of credits, what I call market-based credits, but also that it wants to operate in different streams. So hopefully that will be the case, but it's not finalized yet. And you know, later in the presentation, we'll talk about some of the technical details. But at a high level, it's just important to understand there's two types of REDD+ market. What we call a concessional market, as Simon was talking about, what donor funds, but really concessional just means that the money is given to a REDD+ program at the jurisdictional scale, the national scale, and there's no requirement for a credit to be transferred outside of the country's accounting system. And on the other hand, there's the market-based system, where most of the time that will require that REDD+ credit to be taken out of the country program or the subnational program. However, some market-based systems are domestic. There are domestic market-based transactions, and then there are internationally based market transactions, which in the case of a domestic market, it's not necessarily exported. The country looks at that in a type of hybrid fashion. Obviously, there's a couple of different scales that we need to segment as well. There's the national and jurisdictional scale. Where government really holds the credits on behalf of other people. Then there's and in the MRV, and the whole project design is done at that scale. And then there's the project scale, which is what we've seen, you know, to date at the site level and has been successful, but that's a key issue now. And then there's this intermediate situation of jurisdictionally nested projects. So those are the sort of key differentiations that are important to think about, and for governments to think about when they are planning and structuring their business plan, so to speak, for REDD+. So as Simon and Stefano mentioned, I think everyone's aware, we have some existing markets, the bilateral and multilateral funds, there's the Norwegian programs that Simon mentioned, and some, German and British programs, as well as the FCPF, the GCF, those bilateral and multilateral funds. Those are mostly concessional, but they're actually not all, they're not totally concessional. So part of the FCPF requires an export of credits, about 5% of the deal. Also, the GCF is actually not always concessional. It doesn't always allow for concessional finance and wants to actually sometimes underwrite and support international transaction and market-based transactions with its funding. So national and subnational compliance is another key market for REDD+. It's market-based, but there is, again, this issue of it being domestic, like you have in Colombia.
Michael, Juan.
Ay, sí,
Hay
sí.
comentarios en el chat donde no pueden ver varias personas la presentación.
Ya, ¿será que trato de descargarla pero ustedes están viendo mi pantalla?
Estamos viendo una pantalla de Simon Henry.
Porque
y
no.
no se ve la presentación.
You can only see the presentation in the primary channel. If you're in the translation channel, you can't see it.
Yeah.
Yo no estoy en el translation channel.
En este chat, que es el principal, hay tal vez 5 o 6 comentarios que no pueden ver la presentación. Entonces creo que estamos viendo es la pantalla. Yo veo una pantalla donde dice Simon Henry y ahí está paralizado. Es lo que estoy viendo yo. Una pantalla de esto es de un Mac, tal vez.
Pero tú estás en la pantalla de traducción o en la pantalla principal.
Principal,
Sí.
esta es la principal.
O sea, porque yo estoy hablando por la principal y estoy sharing ahí en la principal. O sea, voy a pararla de compartir. Sorry, Michael, let us just try to
No
solve
worries.
this. Okay. Entonces yo la paro de compartir aquí. ¿Y qué ven ahora?
Yo veo la pantalla que dice Simon Henry y todos los
Pero
chats.
tú estás en la pantalla, en el principal.
Simon, are you still sharing your screen? Can you stop sharing your screen if it's still sharing at your side?
I wasn't sharing
maybe.
I wasn't sharing my screen, so I don't know, because it was just on my slides were on Stefano's presentation.
Okay.
Though I see my initials highlighted on the screen, so I don't know why that is.
Yeah.
The sharing symbol from Simon shows that he's still sharing his screen.
Yeah. Somebody. Yeah, I think somebody in the translation.
It was
sharing.
working for me. It was. I saw it on your screen, Juan Andres. I don't know who else is having problems.
Should I try again ¿Puede todo el mundo ver si tienen el logo de compartir, si lo tienen activado? Porque a lo mejor ese es el problema. Yo voy a tratar de compartirla otra vez, a ver qué pasa.
Juan Andrés, lo que pasa es que Simon Henry tiene el logo de compartir en su pantalla.
Okay, Simon, it seems it is you or Stefano. Or Stefano that may be sharing without noticing.
I'll log out and see what happens.
Okay. Okay, ¿ahora se mejoró?
No.
No, sigue igual.
Sigue igual.
Stefano, are you by any chance sharing the screen?
No, I don't think so, because it never worked, and what you see is not my computer. But I can also try to log out and come back if that helps.
Yeah. Okay, please. Sorry about this.
No problem.
Juan Andrés,
Ah,
Simon Henry dijo que iba a hacer un logout y no, ahí todavía está.
Ahí
no,
debe
pero
hacer,
él
debe darle
no es
clic
el problema.
en el compartir pantalla, debe darle X, que ahí se nota que está compartiendo pantalla, simplemente darle clic en la X.
Donde Simon está todavía en
Sí,
la plataforma.
sí, está en la plataforma y en el loguito de compartir pantalla está la X.
Did you assign it to him, Juan Andres? Did you at some point try and assign it to Simon?
No.
Okay.
Simon, are you still there? Simon is not there.
So Juan Andres, there's people suggesting we just carry on with audio. That's okay. Shall I carry on with audio for now and you try and figure it out? I think it can be seen. It just froze as some people were commenting in the main channel. I could see it fine on your, if you just pull it, I see your screen right now. So if you maybe just pull it up again and we can try like that. And I'll just,
Okay, voy a tratar.
what do you think?
Let's see.
Juan Andrés, uno puede ver que Simon está conectado porque abajo en la lista de personas ahí está.
Lo raro es que estemos en dos pantallas.
No, yo creo que, bueno, lo que pasa es que hay tal vez, o es un pantallazo, porque aparece en el minuto 52, Simon Henry en el minuto 52, y estamos en el
Ajá.
minuto, pues, 72. Entonces, ese pantallazo es tal vez de hace 20 minutos. Entonces, estamos viendo es la pantalla, tal vez, no sé si es la pantalla de Juan, que estaba tomando pantallazos para las preguntas, tal vez, de Simon. Ahí aparece...
No, mi pantalla es esta que está, no sé si la están viendo, que estoy abriendo otra vez la presentación de Michael.
Mira, Simon está entrando en el lobby, está en el lobby y nosotros seguimos viendo ese pantallazo, tienes razón, del minuto 52 de las 10:42, o sea, de hace un rato.
Can anybody, Simon, are you there?
Juan Andres, I think we can see your screen, my friend. Fine.
You see my screen. That's what
Yeah.
that's what is strange. Huh? So, ¿hay alguien de los que están oyendo en español que ven la pantalla aquí, la presentación?
No,
¿Alguien que?
yo estoy en español.
No vemos nada.
Entonces,
Pues yo veo lo mismo que he visto hace rato, no ha cambiado.
Okay.
Juan Andrés,
entonces voy a...
Quita tu pantalla.
Me meto a... Sí. Y me meto, me salgo y me vuelvo a meter por el link. Me voy a salir yo, a ver. Y me vuelvo a meter, ¿ok? Bueno, bien.
Ok. Listo, mientras solucionamos este lapsus técnico, salió Juan, pero se sigue viendo esa pantalla.
Shall I just do the audio? Does that work for you, Juan Andres, and everybody?
No,
Juan is out, Michael.
We listen to you perfectly, but we see.
Yeah, but I think a lot of people are saying just to listen is fine. So maybe I can continue like that for now.
Y no hay como una opción para que sacar una persona comparta pantalla. Melissa, hay una opción solo para que una
Sí.
persona comparta pantalla y bloquear como esa posibilidad del resto.
Déjame, ya reviso. En las opciones no me aparece.
Ah, ya, seguramente. Es que a mí me aparece acá es Juan Andrés, pero seguramente Juan Andrés se desconectó por un lado y dejó conectado este. Porque aparece como si estuviera compartiendo pantalla. Parece como si Andrés estuviera viendo la pantalla de Simon Henry.
So some people, Juan Andres, do see your screen. They do see your screen.
Sí.
Juan Andrés dice que no puede entrar.
Ya le envío el link por el chat. Copiar. A ver. A ver, hagamos una cosa. Claro, ya. Ustedes pueden ver un Word que estoy compartiendo, ¿lo ve todo el mundo?
No.
¿No?
No.
Ok, entonces entiendo que la persona que está compartiendo dejaría bloqueados para que los demás compartan pantalla, según entiendo
Ahí veo que es la pantalla de Juan Andrés.
Ya. Sí, ahí está Juan Andrés. Pero lo que entiendo es que como seguramente Juan Andrés estaba con dos links, se desconectó de uno, pero dejó de estar compartiendo. Pero creo que ya no hay... ya no se ve la pantalla.
Sí se ve. La de Juan Andrés se ve. Se ve un pantallazo que dice Juan Andrés invitado y atrás Simon Henry, un pantallazo que tomó Juan Andrés.
Todavía se ve.
I'm just going to try sharing my screen again, okay?
Juan Andrés dice que está tratando de entrar a la principal y Melissa no lo deja entrar. Debe ser que él quedó en la otra.
En la del audio. Quedó en la de audio.
Juan Andrés.
Entonces, Melissa, por favor, si puedes habilitarle la cámara a Andrés.
Lo que pasa es que no me aparece en la sala para aceptarlo.
Qué bueno. No me aceptan.
Incluso me aparece conectado, me aparece Juan Andrés invitado, conectado.
Y es que él está ahí.
Listo, a ver.
Ya le tomé foto y se la mandé a Juan Andrés.
También con pantallazo, porque parece que estuviera conectado.
Ah, pero
Sí,
ahora ya no aparece el nombre de Juan Andrés.
A ver. Me sigue apareciendo Juan Andrés López.
Bueno.
Melissa, ¿no se puede sacar desde la administradora Juan Andrés?
ya lo saco. En teoría ya lo saqué.
Me sigue apareciendo en la parte inferior derecha.
Voy a salir y vuelvo a entrar.
Ok.
Es un Apple y la flechita está señalando Microsoft Excel.
Sí, es como un... Pero a mí ya me sale, solo puedo en la parte inferior derecha que aparece el nombre de Juan, pero no aparece la pantalla de él. Es muy raro.
A mí me volvió a salir Juan Andrés en la parte inferior izquierda, bueno, derecha de la pantalla.
Claro, es que me sale a mí en el chat, bueno, en las personas que están, me aparece 19 presentadores y 20 personas que estamos atendiendo el evento. Entonces, tal vez en alguno de esos 19 presentadores, creo que, no sé, de pronto David, Ned Kumar, María Cristina están en on hold. Tal vez si de pronto le quitan, no sé si sean ellos, David Ner Krumar y María Cristina Salas, que me parecen en on hold. No sé si de pronto se estarán compartiendo.
Es que nosotros estamos en presentadores.
Hay 19 personas.
Hay 19 personas presentadoras y 20 que atienden.
Así es. María Cristina y David Ner, ustedes están presentando, a mí me sale como que on hold. Entonces, no sé si de pronto están viendo...
¿Y qué tal si todos salimos y volvemos a entrar?
Dice Juan Andrés que le diga a Lucas que ponga el PPT y que sigamos y él hace reload.
Listo.
O salgamos y volvamos a entrar.
A ver, intentemos por acá. Presentación 11. Están... No sé si están viendo mi pantalla. Ah, no. A ver. No me deja compartir. Yo creo que la solución más rápida, también viendo la cantidad de personas, sería que saliéramos rápido y volviéramos a ingresar. Sería como la única. Melissa. Melissa. Melissa, ¿estás ahí? Melissa también salió. Bueno, yo regálame un segundito, yo hago aquí un par de llamadas porque creo que Melissa también se salió y es la que está, si nos salimos todos, ella es quien nos debe aceptar el ingreso y si no está, quedamos todos por fuera. Entonces voy a hacer esa llamada.
Yeah, I think someone's made a good point. It just seems that it's slow for everybody. And it was showing the presentation in Juan Andres' thing, and it just froze for some people. Maybe the audio is working okay, and we just do it like that.
Yeah, that's true. It can work.
Okay, so I will continue with that for the moment. If you want to change, and then just let me know. How about that?
It's good for me.
All right. Okay, so we spoke about bilateral, multilateral funds mainly being concessional, being there now. It is sometimes market-based. The national and sub-national compliance markets, really that's only Colombia for REDD+, and that's a domestic market, so no export. And the only other market right now, really, for REDD+ is the voluntary market. So that is a mix. That's a very important issue of how the voluntary market works, whether it's market-based. It actually can be concessional. That's an important point to come back to later on. So in the future, other markets may be ITMOs and Article 6.
Hola, mi pantalla.
And
Hola.
ITMOs are market-based. If they are agreed, the framework, which we hope maybe next year, at the end of next year. As you saw, there are some pilots already happening. This could be probably the most important market. CORSIA, again, will be market-based, means an export of the credit. Maybe quite a small market due to the pandemic, and even actually in the medium to long term, it wasn't such a big market, but it's sad that we're seeing some delays with it because it was obviously helpful. So other kind of interesting markets which may develop are subsidy schemes, domestic subsidy schemes in Indonesia, in Chile. They've been looking at those. Those are normally, it's not really relevant whether it's market-based because it's a domestic situation. And hopefully REDD+ may even become eligible for other type of ecosystem service markets like biodiversity credits, land banks, things like that. So when we look at each market, what's really important, it is the volume, the total volume of the market, the price per ton, when, right? Is it happening now? Is it gonna happen? Is it far off? And what technically one needs to be able to access it, the contractual requirements, the way that they allow you to account for your emissions as a project or requiring you to align jurisdictionally. So additionally, some of these markets are dedicated to REDD+, like these special funds, the FCPF or the GCF not, that's for renewable energy, that's for climate finance in general. So what percentage can REDD+ be for that? We're in competition with other types of forestry and land use, renewable energy and things like that. But over time, it is felt that even where there is competition, as Simon mentioned, REDD+ will be, a very key part as things like renewable energy are no longer accepted because they're normalized and they're not seen as additional. Obviously, another important factor is whether a market that's available to REDD+ will give an additional premium for the social or wildlife impact. In the domestic carbon tax market in Colombia, unfortunately, we see the same price for a REDD+ ton as we do for a hydro project. So, as I mentioned, the combination of these factors is important when looking at these markets. CORSIA is, after the pandemic recovery, is seen to be a sort of a medium-sized offset market, but REDD+ will only capture maybe 20–25% of that market due to the wide range of eligible units. And we don't know how much of a price premium people will pay for that. So overall, quite a small opportunity for REDD+ CORSIA, but hopefully an opportunity. So with the bilateral and multilateral funding, even if they are quite significant opportunities, the technical requirements are very high, and that can be a problem for REDD+. So maybe just a medium-sized opportunity. Now, unfortunately, the next page would be really helpful to show everybody. It's hard to talk through. It's a simulation of all these different markets, which standards allow you to access them, the price per ton in certain time projections, 2020, 2023, 2025, 2030, 2035, and 2040, the volume available for REDD+, and therefore with the price and the volume projection, the total value of each market. So I'm just going to stop for one little moment here and ask if we fix the slideshow presentation aspect, or I should just go on with audio only? Juan Andres, Melissa?
Hi, Michael. Yeah, let me, Melissa, can you, ¿me puedes autorizar para compartir la pantalla? Porque es que así, es que ese slide que viene ahora es muy importante.
Ya está actualizado. Inténtalo, por favor.
Okay, Michael, let's do one more time.
So you want me to go with audio, or we wait?
No, let me just try once again. I don't know what happened today with this. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, you can. Okay, so let's do this again. Because yes, I know this graph is key for understanding. You have to see, is this one, right?
Okay, so actually for me it's frozen then as well, your screen. I only see your screen, but it's not, the slide isn't coming up.
We can see your slide, Juan Andres. We can see the slide.
You can see it. Okay. It's the one with colors, right? Yeah. La que tiene colores, la pueden ver.
Sí.
Bien. Okay. Listo.
No la
Go
veo.
ahead, Mikey.
Juan, yo no veo la presentación.
No.
Pero bueno, no importa, continuemos así.
Continuemos. La presentación está en el canal principal, que está en inglés. Entonces tienen que poner los dos canales, oír en uno y verla en otro.
Yo estoy en
funciona.
¿No? Bueno, no importa.
No, bueno, sigue. Michael, can you? Some people will see it. Can you see the screen now, Michael?
Let me see. No, I don't see your screen with my slide.
Okay, but we're seeing it. So I mean,
some people
are seeing it.
Some people.
Yeah, some people. So try your best.
So if you can see the slide, there are it's set out with the following information. We have on the left, in a color code, the types of standard. These are actually only the jurisdictional standards, but in the case of project standards, we expect only the voluntary market at the moment. But for the jurisdictional and jurisdictionally nested projects, we have the UNFCCC, the methodological framework from the FCPF, VERA's JNR program, etc. And then the next column is the market, the type of market, ITMOs, buy and multilateral funds, the voluntary market, CORSIA, domestic aviation, that's different to international aviation, and markets like that. And so then we have it projected in those time frames I mentioned, 2020 through to 2040 at different intervals, and with the price, the volume we expect for REDD+, and therefore the total value of that market. Then finally, to the right of that, we have whether or not it's a market-based channel, or it's a concessional channel and requires an export of the credit, or it's just a contribution to the NDC. And then some final notes breaking down what type of clients specifically might be relevant to each channel. So we've been through this actually on a previous presentation. Which of these standards allow you to access which market? So I won't go into that too much. You have that information, and I'll send out this PowerPoint as well, so people can see that afterwards. But just as an example, as Simon mentioned, with CORSIA, they have actually accepted some REDD+ standards. They have even accepted some VERA standards, but JNR scenarios 2 and 3, as I understand. And they have not accepted VERA's VCS project standard for REDD+. As Simon also mentioned, the methodological framework allows you to access the CORSIA market potentially soon, and the ART-tree standard as well. So for in Colombia, in the domestic carbon tax market, we'll also look later in more detail what do you need to do as RENARE comes on stream, and is that also acceptable for the voluntary market, which I'll go into more detail in the following slides. But what I really want you to look at in this slide is which markets in the short, medium, and long term are really important. And as we've already discussed, buying multilateral funds are the biggest market right now. But by 2025, we expect the voluntary market, actually, or I do expect the voluntary market to be the biggest market for REDD+, worth almost 5 billion a year at a price of $12 per ton average, and 400 million tons a year. So that's a really important point, that the voluntary market, even now, as Simon was showing us, is really growing. I'm going to go into the details of what I see as making it grow for REDD+, but also ITMOs. The volume of ITMOs in the medium to long term, if you look across the top, is projected to be over 1 billion tons a year by 2040 for REDD+, as REDD+ becomes really the only one of the key volumes available for those type of offsets, and really one of the few that's really eligible in terms of its additionality. Now, the prices in this screen are relatively conservative, and the volumes are perhaps a little ambitious, but on balance, that's a good indication of how important each market is and in which time frame. So in the medium to longer term, compliance markets, for example, that's emissions trading schemes, offsets under emissions trading schemes, offsets towards carbon taxes, even for infrastructure projects, maybe REDD+ will become eligible to provide offsets under those types of frameworks. The prices already are increasing internationally, not in Colombia, but and we don't have yet an example, whether it be California or South Korea or potentially eligible markets yet. But over time, even if we get small volumes into these markets, because the prices are projected to be, $40, $50, up to $100 in the medium term, that could be an important market for REDD+. So if we just talk about some of the practical details about who are the actual clients in each situation. So in terms of ITMOs, we know that Japan and South Korea, Switzerland, Saudi Arabia, Canada, countries like that have said they want to buy international mitigation outcomes. You've heard about, we all know quite well who the current buy and multilateral funds are. But in the voluntary market, we're seeing even people you'd think who are in compliance, such as oil and gas and extractive companies, participate. And I'll go into more detail about that and why the voluntary market is coming out as such a strong and important market. Consumer goods companies, fashion companies, finance and insurance group, technology companies, they're all getting in, and that's just one part of it. The voluntary market is really expanding. CORSIA, I just would like to mention that, it's not potentially attractive, and it's international airlines. What is perhaps a more interesting opportunity, and it's sort of a voluntary market, are domestic airlines. We don't see domestic airlines regulated so much in compliance schemes in the US. They are joining CORSIA, but the domestic airlines won't be captured by that. So important, and that's in other countries too. So domestic aviation is a potentially key market within the voluntary market. So, Juan Andres, I'm going to go to the next slide if you're able to scroll down for everybody, please.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So before the COVID pandemic, we really were seeing a huge acceleration of the voluntary market. Now, there is still some momentum with that. It hasn't totally fallen away, but that acceleration, it has been muzzled, has been contained. Especially, as I mentioned, domestic airlines, Delta in the United States, EasyJet. Obviously, these voluntary commitments were quite significant, but as you know, global air travel falls for these more domestic airlines, then their unfortunately their voluntary demand has subsided as well, and just the general state of the economy. And really that's affected the price a bit, and people are looking for cheaper offsets, more in renewable energy still, things like that. But there's still a lot of strong momentum in the voluntary market. You know, we have this net zero commitment. So something I want to expand on. You know, we have these big companies. Here's a little list: Adobe, Capgemini, Diageo, Boston Consulting Group, Schneider Electric, Volkswagen, Rolls-Royce, Evian, Danone, many companies announcing these net zero commitments. However, when you look at the detail of what these net zero commitments actually means, there's a lot of differentiation. It can mean that by 2050, a company through internal means will become net zero. However, it can mean that right now, companies have said, yes, we're on a journey by 2040 or 2050 to eliminate most of our emissions internally, but even right now, we want to offset what we haven't yet reduced. So the average commitment is actually something in between. It has what's known as an interim target, normally around 2025, 2030, and there are different proposals for what a net zero commitment should mean. But indicatively, it's to have an interim target, which is less, there's less expectation to make internal reductions, so more offsetting, and then a longer term target to 2040, 2050, where the majority of these companies' internal emissions will be reduced internally or through economy-wide reductions, and there will be a small amount of offsetting. So lots of good momentum there, but different details, and REDD+ certainly is benefiting from that and will continue to. So some companies like Microsoft and Velux have actually gone even a step further. This is a very positive outlier. You know, they've said not only are we going to be carbon neutral and offset what we can't reduce right now, but we're actually going to go back in time to when we started, whether, you know, early in the last century or in the middle part of the last century, and we're going to take account and offset our emissions for our history too. And other very interesting commitments, like Boston Consulting Group has said that, you know, it is planning to pay $35 per ton by 2025 for a combination of nature-based offsets and engineered carbon capture and storage offsets, and that by 2030 it's put aside an $80 per ton price. So very encouraging with some of these companies, but got to look at the detail. So the thing with this exciting voluntary market, which has been slightly dampened by the pandemic, is that it's really not uniform. However, you know, there's a lot of complexity within the voluntary market, and I'm going to break it down into 4 key categories and what type of volumes they transact at, what type of price they're currently transacting at, and an example of who these people are. So, as I mentioned, some of the really big buyers are these domestic airlines, extractive industries from oil and gas and coal and companies like that. And they are really looking to buy 100,000 to 1 million tons plus at a time. But the price that they want to pay is obviously, as a result, discounted. So they're currently buying from as little as $2.50 per ton to $5 per ton. So Shell is a good example of that. And you know, what they're doing with that is they are selling on the credits to consumers at the pump, selling it on to private aviation companies where they supply the jet fuel. So that gives you an idea of the chain in that voluntary market, the value chain. There are companies like BHP Billiton who, you know, they just see it as good business and CSR and part of their commitments. I mentioned some of those airlines, Delta Airways, JetBlue, EasyJet, that there are others. So those are the big people. It's a larger volume market, but the prices are lower. Then then the next category is consumer goods and service companies. They are looking to buy in their transactions annually 10,000 to 100,000 tons a year. It's a big amount still, but smaller. And they will pay a higher price because they will pay between $4 a ton to $12 a ton at the moment. So we're talking about companies like Microsoft, Disney, Kering, who own the Gucci and Yves Saint Laurent brands, Intuit, who do a very QuickBooks. I don't know if that's used in Colombia. It's a very big accounting software company in America. Then we have sort of smaller and medium-sized companies. You know, your local store. They can vary in size from, you know, your local bike shop through to a big, quite a famous food or drinks company. But these people are buying about 1,000 tons to 10,000 tons a year in their transactions, and they pay a higher price, anywhere between $5 a ton to $15 a ton. And the last market, which is a growing market and is something our organization is involved with through our Stand for Trees program, is direct to the public sales. So these are tiny $1 to $100, 1 ton to 100 ton transactions, but they're aggregated. These are people buying online through digital platforms, things like that. And the prices there are higher still, $8 to $17 a ton. So some groups that do that, Cool Effects, you may have heard of, us, our Stand for Trees program, Offset Earth. There are many of these groups coming through now. So Juan Andres, please just scroll down a little bit. I'm actually looking at my presentation. So, but the next section on my file, but I'm good. The next section covers headline prices, not necessarily possible. So even as we look at those price profiles in the voluntary market, whether you can actually access those or you can get that full price actually has some more issues you have to consider. The quality of your project and the standards that you use and the chain, whether you're working with a broker, obviously, things like that, it really makes a difference to how much of that headline price a REDD+ project can actually capture. So in terms of the project standards, which the voluntary market appreciates, the VCS project standard and the Plan Vivo standard as well are accepted quite well in the voluntary market. The local standards in Colombia, you know, that hasn't really been tested, I would say, in the international voluntary market that I'm really talking about. So that's something to consider. And actually, not only that, but voluntary market often demands additional socio and economic certification through standards like the CCB. That, I would say, is the minimum to really get a good price that you want to achieve. And if you can achieve a gold level award, either one or all three of the climate, community, or biodiversity awards under the CCB, that really helps. There are some other extra standards like social carbon based out of Brazil, but those are important in terms of capturing more of the headline price. So jurisdictional standards is something that is not so well tested yet in the voluntary market, but it's an issue that we're all going to have to think about, you know, as we find out more how it's going to work in Colombia and in other countries as projects nest into national frameworks. You know, there's the VERA JNR standard, even the FCPF methodological framework, ARC-TRIZ. I would say that all of those will be very, you know, adopted by the voluntary market. That's a projection, but I think that people appreciate what's going on there, although obviously they do like to you know, have a clearly defined nested project often. But that wider jurisdictional crediting and standards will be probably good for the voluntary market. We don't know about, you know, countries operating outside of those types of standards, you know, like developing their own standards under the UNFCCC framework. We'll have to see. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail about some of the changes going on with the international voluntary market. But the next set of points is also important in terms of understanding how the chain of sale really works in these voluntary markets. So if you don't have the capacity as a REDD+ project and a management team, you know, to talk and try and do sales and marketing activities towards these different voluntary segments, you will need a broker, someone who specializes in that. They will need a commission. So you've obviously got to factor that into your gross and net prices. What these voluntary buyers really want is stories, videos, photos, really impactful content, and that they can communicate to their shareholders, to their customers. And if you can't supply that, you know, really sophisticated videos, again, you're not going to capture, you know, the top and headline prices in those different segments. But additionally, they need a lot of technical support. You know, as we all know how complex this sector is, that's also an important part, hand-holding. They also need footprinting and additional sustainability support. So then often first part of the process is to understand their footprint before they can, you know, offset it. That's not easy to do, and that can require specialist assistance and specialist partners who may need a commission, or that'll come out of that, potentially out of that transaction price. So, you know, are you an integrated project developer with these, you know, really important marketing capacities like South Pole, some Althelia Ecosphere, some of these groups, and Wildlife Works with Everland, who have a relatively integrated capacity from project development, you know, through to marketing. They will be able to capture more of those prices and more of those deals. So you may want to team up with people like that, because it is a real factor. So, you know, other people, a good way to capture, you know, the voluntary market higher end prices is to have captive buyers, to start these projects early with one or two people who basically come to own the project. They almost provide you the investment capital. You know, for example, there's a fund with Danone called the Restoration Fund, and with the Evian, you know, they knew the offsets they were going to buy. They took the money and invested it in projects, and that's also a model which I think is quite interesting in the voluntary market. What are other important dynamics going on in the voluntary market? Well, at the project level, that we have endured and seen, you know, quite a lot of anti-REDD+ sentiment. And that has had its effect, but it hasn't really been a problem. It's kind of fallen away. There are certain environmental groups, certain newspapers who have come out, you know, with quite biased and one-sided negative stories, but that doesn't seem to have affected the market. However, there is still quite a lot of that ongoing, and it's getting more sophisticated. And I think you're going to see, there's been a recent study published by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science in America, very, very well-respected institution, about how projects in Brazil are not accounting for jurisdictional scale activities and inflating their baselines. And, you know, we've had the Guardian newspaper in Britain, one of the most famous international newspapers, you know, threatening to release stories about this issue. So behind the surface, I think we all have to understand that technically the viability of REDD+ projects is still under some pressure. And to be fair, I think it is some baselines for some projects are an issue, but you know, it's not black and white. And but I just wanted to mention that. I do think a really key trend is the digital infrastructure that's increasing in the voluntary market for people to do offsets and also to do footprinting for businesses. You're starting to see large technology companies like Intuit, Salesforce, Microsoft develop digital platforms that'll make it much easier to do footprinting and buy credits. I think that's going to help. Groups like ours are proliferating, like Stanford Trees and our competitors. They are increasing every day. I think that's a really interesting area. The last key point I think is important internationally when thinking about the voluntary market is the transition it's going to be going through this year as we move to national level accounting. And you know, Vera, our colleague and co-member here on the working group, is a key part of this and a leader in this area. And it'd be great to hear more from them. And I know they're going to make some public announcement, and other standards like the gold standard are looking at this. But just to kind of, from what I've heard, we think there's going to be two types of voluntary market credit. Hopefully, I think it's a good thing. It's not confirmed yet, but there'll be voluntary market credits which require an export corresponding adjustment situation. And then there may be these voluntary credits which are seen as more as the financing of mitigation in a developing country. And there is, you know, the retirement and everything is made locally, and it's kind of a joint claim based on that. That's an important issue for both project developers to understand and buyers may be sensitive to, and so you've got to be aware of that. So the last thing I want to mention, and Juan Andres asked me to mention, was, you know, in Colombia, what are the technical issues with accessing these international voluntary markets that we see as increasingly important? So we know that the Colombian government has said that it's going to do corresponding adjustments, that it's going to set up this registry. So that's a positive. But does that mean that all the projects have to be registered through RENARE? Or is that only if you want to be eligible for the carbon tax? That is not, to me, 100% clear yet. If other members of the group know more about that, that would be very good to understand. You know, as mentioned before also, projects in Colombia have the opportunity to opt out of the national or subnational programs if they want to. But again, does that mean that they will continue to do VCS project-based verification? According to the VCS rules, as I understand them, if the jurisdiction or the country has given permission for you to be outside of their jurisdictional capture, that is okay. You can continue to do that. But, you know, I think it's not 100% clear how that's all going to work yet. Then for the elements of the non-overlapping pools between the jurisdictional programs, if you are nested or if you're not nested, if you're carved out, so to speak, degradation, soils, mangroves, you know, that we need to understand clearly how that's going to work. And the whole nesting process, you know, and whether you are, you know, and whether you do go through RENARE in Colombia with this methodological reconstruction, you know, the FIG going through all of that, will that still allow you to be part of the voluntary market? Does it make sense for you? And finally, just what I've mentioned before, you know, what standards, this Colombian standard that's going to be developed under the methodological reconstruction or other standards locally that will be developed to support that, is that going to be enough for the voluntary market? Is that going to have high enough socio-environmental standards within it to capture these higher prices? And I think that's where I'll leave it. Hope that was useful.
Ok, bueno, muchas gracias, Michael. Lo voy a cerrar acá. Entramos ahora a la sesión de preguntas. Lucas, como yo estaba aquí con problemas de entrar y salir, ¿quieres tú hacer la lectura de las preguntas que en el orden que fueron llegando?
Juan Andrés, entonces, a ver, yo las pasé aquí por escrito y las envié por WhatsApp. Entonces, si quieres, bueno, pues tenemos la primera es de Edward Romsit. Y la otra, creo que mi inglés, Juan, para pasar las preguntas. Entonces, si tienes acceso a tu WhatsApp, ahí ya tienes las preguntas por escrito. Para pasarlas primero a Estefano, que hay unas preguntas de Edward, de Oscar y de Abraham y de Camilo, y solo tengo una para Michael.
Ok, bueno, yo tengo aquí, si quieres, entonces sí las leo. Para Estefano. Estefano, are you there? I'm not sure if Stefano is on, or Simon. Stefano or Simon, are you there? I think I'm not sure if they're listening. Stefano.
Juan, ahí estoy leyendo en el chat que Estefano salió y Simon salió y se volvió a unir, o sea que Simon está en mute.
Simon está en...
puede quitarse el mute.
Ok. O si tienes preguntas para Michael mientras que Simon soluciona su micrófono. Acá hay una de Kevin Ocampo para Michael.
Es la única.
Okay. So Michael, here is a question for you. Given the profiles in the carbon markets, which companies are most likely to buy premium carbon credits that involve intense cultural, environmental, and social co-benefits?
Juan Andres, can you repeat that, please?
Yes, and also if you see in the chat is written there but I will repeat. Given the profiles in the carbon markets, which companies are most likely to buy premium carbon credits that involve intense cultural, environmental, and social co-benefits?
I think all of the segments in the voluntary market, but if I was to say maybe the one that would be slightly less would be the small and medium-sized companies, because they're not under so much scrutiny. I think the public sales through digital platforms will require a high standard. The sales to the sort of consumer goods and services companies will require very high standards. And to the major purchases by oil and gas companies and airlines, they will also require high standards and social impacts. But if one of those markets was maybe less stringent, I would say it's the sort of small and medium-sized companies.
Okay. Okay, Kevin, si tienes dudas, por favor escribe en el chat y la volvemos y seguimos sobre eso. Creo que I think Stefano is here. Stefano, can we pose you the questions that we have for you? I don't know. Stefano or Simon. Parece que no. Tienen problemas ahí con el sonido. No, Simon dice que Melissa, que si puedes quitarle el control de sonido a Simon, porque él no puede hablar. Creo que lo pusiste en silencio. Melissa. Y ahora ya no oigo a nadie. A ver. Aló. Dice que Estefano ha contestado, pero que nadie lo oye. Lucas,
no lo he escuchado, no lo he escuchado, solo te escucho a ti por
Sí.
este canal.
Así es.
Sí. ¿Y ellos será que están usando otro canal?
Me parece que está conectado por acá Estefano. Estefano salió y volvió a entrar, entonces Estefano parece que ya está. Volvió a salir.
Es que dicen que ellos no, que los tienen en silencio. Melissa o quien organizó tiene el micrófono en silencio, es lo que ellos dicen ahí. Melissa, ¿puedes mirar? Simon dice que está en el main channel. No sé qué pasa aquí.
Sí, está comentando por acá Simon, es porque está por el principal.
Sí, pero no puede hablar. Y yo creo que tiene que ser con el problema Melissa que organizó, pues porque debe ser que espichó un botón de silenciar al resto. ¿Melissa? A ver. Simon. Pero Melissa está por ahí. ¿Alguna pregunta más para Michael mientras solucionamos el tema de...
Melissa está comentando por el chat principal que no se ha hecho ningún cambio en la configuración y tampoco puede hablar por el micrófono.
No. Qué lío.
I'm here, Juan Andres, if you want to ask a question.
Well, Michael, I had one question for you. You presented like 4 kinds of markets and different prices and different type of volumes. Are those current markets or are those future expected markets? Or is that... Okay, go ahead.
Those are all right now.
Okay, because what we see from Stefano's and Simon's presentation, that the prices are very low, but what we saw in your presentation is that the prices are attractive.
So Stefano and Simon's presentation was only covering 2019, and they were average prices. So if you look at my one, I'm saying that in the high volume transactions with airlines and with oil and gas companies where they're buying hundreds of thousands and millions of tons, it's true, the prices are still quite low, anywhere from $2.50 per ton to $5 a ton only. And these represent very big volumes, so it affects the average price. But if you look at each market that I mentioned individually, the prices start to go up.
Thank you, Michael. Yo veo que el problema técnico no se ha resuelto, entonces tengo una sugerencia y es la siguiente. Si alguien tiene preguntas para Michael, él las puede contestar ya, y si no, las preguntas para Simon y Stefano, vamos a pedirles a ver si de pronto nos pueden mandar unos bullets de respuesta por escrito y así tenemos algún tipo de respuesta después y la hacemos llegar al correo de todos ustedes, igual que las presentaciones en PowerPoint, porque si no, pues ya estamos cerca de las 12, entonces yo creo que no, ya este es un problema mayor. Esa es mi sugerencia. Lucas, no sé qué opinas, and Stefano and Simon, I'm taking the liberty to ask you if you could send us by email or chat some bullets responding to the questions we have here recorded for you, and then we can distribute to everybody, so we don't lose the chance to have this interaction. And with that, I would probably suggest we end up the webinar, unless there is another question for Michael. And here Ed Ramsey is saying that the hurdle in Colombia is a lack of supply. Is that a question for Michael? I suppose. Michael, do you want to comment?
So I understand that the problem in Colombia is not the demand, but it's the price, and it's the technical transition that's going on with Renare and the methodological reconstruction. So yes, there is demand in the compliance market in Colombia, but it's maybe $4 per ton. REDD+ projects get the same prices as hydro projects or renewable energy projects. These are the issues.
Okay. I have another question here. Well, it's from Ed Ramsey. It's on the same. If the Colombia domestic market is so undersupplied, why target international markets? This is a question for the panel. I have my own response to that. Is that we foresee millions of tons coming to the market, and there is this I don't find the right word to say, maybe a conflict or risk of getting the credits in line with the potential jurisdictions like Visión Amazonía or other that the government may want to set up. So it may crowd out some of the developments that are happening in the projects. That's my own my impression is that there is going to be a lot of supply in the market in the next this year and the next year. And you just can see it if you go and check what is registered in Verra and the markets and in talking to the colleagues on what projects are being developed. So that's my own take. So I would since this is a panel, I would like to have Michael also comment on that. And I have this other question from Camilo to before I pass you the floor, Michael. it says that the red projects are very appreciated by the market, but there are some technical concerns, and that's why probably CORSIA have excluded this kind of projects. So what needs to be solved so that these projects can be accepted by the different market rules? I think this is a question for you and also for Stefano and Simon. So Stefano and Simon, if you can later give your feedback, it will be fine. Michael, go ahead.
So I think there does need to be a consolidation of some reference levels. As we heard, for people who are on the presentation from Lucio Pedroni last time, he explained it very well. You know, yes, some of these projects through the VCS Red Project Standard have taken risk calculations, threat levels from a very wide area and applied them to their project. But as you move to the jurisdictional program and you look at allocating the reference levels on a risk basis, maybe, as we heard, maybe how close you are to previous deforestation rather than just being in the general area, that allocation of the risk, I think, will need to be consolidated. Some of those projects are genuinely, going to keep a lot of that reference level and baseline. Others will need to consolidate. And hopefully that process will be worth it for those projects because the prices and the opportunities will be greater.
Okay. And how about the question from Carlos? From Camilo.
Camilo's question, which was?
On the rules. Yeah. Oh, no, you just answered that. Yeah, okay, yeah. So, is there any other question for, alguna otra pregunta para Michael o dejarla por escrito para Simon o Stefano? Ok, yo creo que ya estamos sobre las 12. Lucas, ¿quieres hacer el cierre entonces, por favor?
Claro que sí, Juan, claro que sí. Entonces, en primer lugar, agradecerles a todas las personas asistentes por su paciencia y por las preguntas que alcanzaron a responder en el chat. Esperamos que las que no hayan sido respondidas igual se las enviaremos posteriormente por correo tan pronto Stefano y Michael también nos den retroalimentación de esas preguntas y con este tema pasaríamos entonces a Juan, si te parece bien, a definir una próxima fecha y tema del próximo webinar y claramente con las lecciones aprendidas que hoy en las conversaciones internas no sabemos qué fue lo que pasó porque es muy extraño cómo está funcionando hoy la plataforma. Ha tenido bastantes problemas que no terminamos de comprender hasta el momento.
Sí, gracias, Lucas. Lo que yo sugiero, y pues no tenemos mucho tiempo porque yo sé que la gente ya está abandonando, pues tienen que irse. Pero lo que yo sugiero es seguir profundizando un poco sobre el mercado hoy, el mercado red afuera, como vieron de los precios y los volúmenes que presentó Michael y lo que la gente dice, digamos, entre colegas, hay unos precios altos y atractivos afuera. Eso es una de las razones para ver el mercado afuera, es que no es solamente la demanda, sino que los precios, pues se dice que están por encima de los $8 o más. Hay gente que habla de 12, pero que son para cierto tipo de proyectos y seguramente para mercados nicho especializados. A mí me parece que ese tema sigue siendo importante. Si les parece, haríamos otra ronda con estos temas y ya les diríamos a qué presentadores tendríamos invitados.
De acuerdo, Juan. Perfecto. Perfecto, entonces, digamos, con esta conclusión, cerramos el webinar y estaremos haciendo, como indica Juan, una segunda ronda para mercados de carbono, mercados voluntarios de carbono red, con otros presentadores que nos permitan ampliar más la visión de el panorama que nos ha presentado tanto Estefano de IETA como Michael de Red. Entonces, muchas gracias a todos nuevamente por su asistencia, por su paciencia y por su permanencia en este webinar, y esperamos para el próximo webinar solucionar estos impases técnicos que se presentaron hoy. Entonces, bueno, muchas gracias a todos y nos veremos en el próximo webinar.
Ok, gracias a todos. Adiós.
Hasta luego.